The execution was scheduled for dawn, but the crowd had been gathering since midnight. In the center of the town square stood a massive wooden wheel, roughly 8 feet in diameter, mounted horizontally on a thick post. Hans Weber, a blacksmith convicted of theft, was dragged from his cell at first light. His crime: stealing 2 loaves of bread to feed his children. What happened next wasn't an execution. It was a systematic destruction of the human body designed to maximize suffering while preventing death for as long as possible. The executioner, a man named Friedrich Gottlieb, approached with a leather bag containing his tools. Inside were specialized iron hammers of different weights and sizes. Each one served a specific purpose in the breaking process. Weber was stripped naked and tied to the wheel with leather straps, his limbs spread outward like a human star. The position alone was agonizing, pulling muscles and joints to their limits. Then Gottlieb began his work. He started with Weber's left hand, specifically the pinky finger. The first strike shattered the smallest bone. Weber's scream cut through the morning air, then the ring finger, then the middle finger, each bone broken individually, methodically, with practiced precision. This wasn't random violence. This was a carefully choreographed performance that followed a manual written by professional executioners and approved by legal authorities. The process was designed to work from the extremities inward: fingers, then hand bones, then wrists, then forearms, then elbows, then upper arms. Only after completely destroying both arms would the executioner move to the legs, following the same meticulous pattern. The entire sequence could take 6 to 8 hours if done properly. But here's what made the breaking wheel truly diabolical. Between each strike, Gottlieb paused. He checked Weber's pulse, examined his eyes for signs of shock, and consulted with a physician who stood nearby. If Weber showed signs of losing consciousness, the doctor would administer stimulants, smelling salts, even force him to drink water mixed with vinegar. The goal wasn't execution. The goal was to keep the victim conscious and feeling every single moment of their own destruction. After 2 hours, Weber's arms hung at impossible angles, bones jutting through skin in multiple places. He had long since stopped screaming. His voice was gone. All that emerged from his throat were wet, gurgling sounds as he tried desperately to form words that wouldn't come. His eyes, wild with pain and terror, darted between his mutilated limbs and the crowd that watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. Gottlieb moved to the legs. The pattern repeated. Toes first, then foot bones, then ankles. By the 4th hour, Weber's body looked less human and more like a broken puppet, limbs twisted at grotesque angles, skin stretched tight over protruding bone fragments. Blood pooled beneath the wheel, dripping steadily onto the cobblestones below. The physician checked Weber's condition again. His heart was still beating strongly. His breathing, though ragged and desperate, remained steady. He was nowhere near death. In fact, medical records from similar executions showed that victims could survive in this state for days if properly maintained. The human body, it turned out, was far more resilient than anyone wanted to believe. Some victims of the breaking wheel reportedly survived for 3 full days after the breaking process was complete. Their shattered bodies left exposed on the wheel as a public warning. They would die slowly from exposure, dehydration, infection, or sometimes from animals that would approach at night to feed on their helpless, broken forms. As the sun reached its zenith and Gottlieb prepared to deliver the final blows to Weber's spine and ribcage, something in the crowd shifted. A woman fainted, a child vomited. But most people stayed, unable to look away from the spectacle of human suffering unfolding before them. What none of them knew was that this particular execution was relatively quick and merciful compared to what the breaking wheel could truly accomplish in the hands of someone who wanted to maximize suffering. The breaking wheel wasn't the product of sadistic imagination. It was the result of careful study, experimentation, and documentation. Medieval and early modern executioners were trained professionals who apprenticed for years to master their craft, and their craft was the precise application of pain without causing premature death. In the archives of German and French courts, historians have discovered execution manuals that read like medical textbooks. These documents, written by master executioners and approved by legal scholars, provided detailed instructions on breaking technique. They included anatomical drawings showing the location of major bones, diagrams indicating the proper angle of hammer strikes, and tables calculating the appropriate force needed to shatter different skeletal structures without causing fatal internal bleeding. One particularly chilling document from 1580s Bavaria outlines the proper progression of breaking. The author, an executioner with over 30 years of experience, explains that the human skeleton contains 206 bones in adults, and that approximately 80 to 90 of these could be broken before death became inevitable. The manual instructs executioners to work methodically from peripheral bones inward, preserving the skull, spine, and rib cage until the final stages. But the true horror lay in the collaboration between executioners and physicians. Medical doctors were required by law to attend breaking wheel executions. Their official purpose was to verify death at the end. Their actual purpose was far more sinister. These physicians studied the human body's response to extreme trauma. They documented heart rates, breathing patterns, pupil dilation, and blood loss at different stages of the breaking process. They experimented with various substances to prevent shock and maintain consciousness. Some used alcohol mixed with herbs. Others employed early forms of adrenaline extracted from animal glands. A few even tried primitive blood transfusions using animal blood in desperate attempts to keep victims alive longer. Court records from a 1612 execution in Stuttgart describe a physician named Dr. Johann Weyer who developed a specialized tonic that he claimed could extend a victim's conscious survival by up to 12 hours. The tonic contained wine, ground coffee beans, a relatively new substance in Europe at the time, extract of willow bark for pain management that wouldn't cause unconsciousness, and crushed peppers to stimulate the heart. Weyer administered this concoction to victims throughout their ordeal, essentially turning them into unwilling subjects in a grotesque medical experiment. The executioners themselves underwent psychological conditioning to perform their work. Apprentices started by practicing on animal carcasses, learning to gauge the exact force needed to break bones of different sizes. They progressed to breaking the already dead bodies of executed criminals, perfecting their technique on human anatomy. Only after years of this training were they permitted to work on living victims. But even with all this preparation, many executioners suffered psychological consequences. Guild records from the 1600s show that alcoholism rates among professional executioners exceeded 70%. Many developed hand tremors that ironically made them less effective at their job. Some experienced vivid nightmares and what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Yet they continued because society demanded it. Breaking wheel executioners were well-paid professionals. In some German states, they earned more than skilled craftsmen or even minor nobles. They received housing, tax exemptions, and guaranteed employment for life. The system created a perverse incentive structure where financial security depended on efficiently destroying human bodies. The breaking wheel also served as a public laboratory for medical knowledge. Physicians learned about bone structure, nerve pathways, and the limits of human endurance by observing these executions. Some of this knowledge, acquired through unspeakable suffering, actually advanced medical understanding of anatomy and trauma treatment. Doctors learned which bones could be set and healed, and which injuries were invariably fatal. They studied pain responses and developed early theories about the nervous system. This created an ethical nightmare that nobody at the time seemed to question. Medical progress was being purchased with human agony, and the victims were often people guilty of minor crimes, or sometimes no crimes at all, just accusations that were impossible to disprove. The worst part? This wasn't happening in some dark, hidden dungeon. These were public events, sanctioned by law, attended by respectable citizens, and documented by educated professionals who saw nothing wrong with transforming human suffering into a science. And the techniques they developed, the methods they perfected, the knowledge they gained, all of this would be passed down through generations of executioners, each one refining the process, making it more efficient, more prolonged, more terrible than the last. The law was clear and unambiguous. In most German and French territories that employed the breaking wheel, immediate family members of the condemned were legally required to attend the execution. Not just permitted to attend, required. Failure to appear could result in fines, public shaming, or even accusations of conspiracy with the condemned. The rationale, according to legal scholars of the time, was that the family needed to witness the consequences of sin and crime. They needed to see what happened when someone strayed from the righteous path. But the reality was far more cruel. This was collective punishment, a way to ensure that the horror of the breaking wheel extended beyond the victim to contaminate entire family lines. Maria Weber stood in the front row of the crowd watching her husband Hans being broken on the wheel. She was 7 months pregnant. Her 3 children stood beside her, the oldest barely 9 years old. By law, they had to remain for the entire execution. Guards were stationed specifically to prevent family members from leaving or looking away. If they closed their eyes or turned their heads, guards would physically force them to watch. The psychological impact on these forced witnesses was catastrophic. Court records and church documents from the 1500s and 1600s contain numerous accounts of family members who developed severe mental problems after witnessing breaking wheel executions. Some stopped speaking entirely, falling into what physicians at the time called melancholia, but what we would recognize as severe traumatic shock. Children were particularly vulnerable. A 1634 report from a parish priest in Württemberg describes a 10-year-old boy named Peter who was forced to watch his father's execution on the breaking wheel. The process took 7 hours. For 7 hours, this child stood 15 feet away from his father, listening to screams that gradually deteriorated into wet, choking sounds. The priest's report states that Peter never spoke another word after that day. He lived to age 32, working as a stable hand, but remained completely mute for the remaining 22 years of his life. Wives of condemned men faced an even more specific torture. In many cases, these women had committed no crime, but they inherited their husband's shame along with his debts. After watching their husbands destroyed on the wheel, they often found themselves destitute and socially ostracized. Some were forbidden from remarrying. Others were forced to leave their towns entirely, taking their traumatized children with them into an uncertain future. But here's where it gets worse. Some jurisdictions didn't just require passive observation. They demanded active participation. In certain German territories, the condemned man's eldest son was required to assist in positioning his father on the wheel. He had to help tie the leather straps, help secure the limbs in the proper position. This forced complicity was intended to demonstrate the family's rejection of the condemned man's crimes, their willingness to participate in justice even when it meant destroying their own father. Records from a 1589 execution in Nuremberg describe 16-year-old Klaus Hoffmann being forced to help strap his father to the breaking wheel. The boy's hands were shaking so violently that he could barely tie the leather restraints. When his father looked at him trying to communicate something, anything, in those final moments, Klaus vomited on himself. The executioner made him clean it up before proceeding. The boy had to stand there, covered in his own vomit, and watch as his father was systematically destroyed over the next 6 hours. Klaus Hoffmann hanged himself 3 weeks later. His mother found him in the barn, dead at 16, unable to live with what he had been forced to do and witness. The authorities ruled it a suicide and refused to allow his burial in consecrated ground. His body was dumped in a mass grave outside the city walls, adding one more layer of trauma to a family that had already been destroyed. Mothers forced to bring nursing infants to executions would try to cover the baby's ears, only to have guards pull their hands away. The sounds of breaking wheel executions were considered part of the punishment, part of the lesson that society needed to learn. Even the smallest children were expected to absorb this horror, to internalize it as a warning about the consequences of transgression. Some family members broke completely during the execution itself. A 1612 court record describes a woman named Anna Schneider, who began screaming uncontrollably while watching her brother being broken. She screamed for so long and so loudly that she damaged her vocal cords permanently. She couldn't scream anymore after that day, couldn't speak above a whisper. She lived another 23 years with a ruined voice, a constant physical reminder of what she had been forced to witness. Other family members attempted suicide at the execution site itself. Guards were specifically instructed to watch for this. Women who tried to throw themselves from viewing platforms were restrained. Men who tried to rush forward to attack the executioner and force a quick death for the victim were beaten back. The execution had to proceed according to schedule, with all required witnesses remaining conscious and observant until the very end. The cumulative trauma created generations of damaged families. Children who witnessed their fathers being broken on the wheel grew up to become parents themselves, but many struggled with severe anxiety, depression, and an inability to form normal emotional connections. Some became violent, acting out the horrors they had witnessed on their own families. Others became completely withdrawn, going through life as emotional ghosts. Parish records show clusters of family suicides in the years following breaking wheel executions. An entire family line could be effectively destroyed by a single execution, not through legal penalty but through psychological annihilation. And this wasn't an unintended side effect. This was deliberate policy, designed to make the punishment extend far beyond the individual condemned person. The message was clear. Crime didn't just destroy the criminal, it destroyed everyone they loved, everyone connected to them, everyone who bore their name. And the breaking wheel made sure that destruction was as visible, as prolonged, and as psychologically devastating as possible. In the summer of 1615, a merchant named Matthias Clausen was convicted of murder in the city of Heidelberg. The crime was legitimate. He had killed a business rival during a dispute over unpaid debts. The sentence was standard for the time: death by breaking wheel. What happened during his execution, however, became one of the most documented cases of prolonged survival in the history of this torture device. Matthias was 42 years old, physically robust from years of loading and unloading merchant cargo. He was bound to the wheel at sunrise on a Tuesday morning. The executioner, a man named Hans Schmidt, who had performed over 300 breaking wheel executions in his 20-year career, began the process exactly as he had been trained. By mid-morning, both of Matthias's arms were completely shattered. By noon, his legs were broken in 17 places. By early afternoon, his ribs had been systematically cracked and his collarbone smashed. The execution should have been finished by sunset. It was not. Matthias remained conscious. His heart continued to beat strongly. His breathing, while labored and painful, never reached the point of respiratory failure. The attending physician, Dr. Wilhelm Brandt, examined him repeatedly and found that despite catastrophic skeletal damage, no major blood vessels had been severed and no organs had been fatally damaged. Matthias was, by all medical measures, still very much alive. As the sun set on that first day, the executioner faced an unprecedented situation. The condemned man had survived the complete breaking process and was still conscious. Legal protocol required that Matthias remain on the wheel until death occurred naturally. So he was left there, his shattered body tied to the wooden wheel in the town square, exposed to the elements. That first night was the worst. Matthias could still speak, though his voice was weak and damaged. Witnesses who remained in the square reported hearing him pray, beg for water, and call out for his mother, who had died 15 years earlier. He wept. He pleaded with God. He screamed whenever his body shifted slightly, and broken bones ground against each other. By morning, he was still alive. Word spread through Heidelberg that the merchant refused to die. Some saw it as a sign of divine intervention, evidence that perhaps God was preserving him because the execution was unjust. Others believed the devil himself was keeping Matthias alive to prolong his suffering. Dr. Brandt visited twice daily to document Matthias's condition. His medical notes, preserved in Heidelberg's city archives, make for horrifying reading. On the second day, Matthias developed a fever as infection began setting into his numerous open wounds. By the third day, he could no longer speak, but his eyes remained open and responsive. He was clearly still conscious, still experiencing everything, but had lost the ability to communicate. The summer heat made everything worse. Flies swarmed around his wounds, laying eggs that would hatch into maggots. Matthias couldn't move to brush them away. He could only lie there, feeling insects crawling through his broken flesh. At night, rats from nearby buildings would approach, drawn by the smell of blood and exposed tissue. Guards were stationed not to protect him, but to ensure no one showed mercy by killing him. By the fourth day, Matthias's body had begun to swell grotesquely from infection and internal bleeding that had nowhere to drain. His skin stretched tight and started splitting in places, oozing a mixture of blood, pus, and lymphatic fluid. Yet his heart continued beating. His chest continued rising and falling with each agonized breath. On the fifth day, something remarkable and terrible happened. Matthias began negotiating his own death. He could no longer speak, but he could still move his eyes. He would look at the guards, at the doctor, at anyone who came near, and attempt to communicate through blinks and eye movements. Dr. Brandt realized what Matthias was trying to do. He was offering a confession to additional crimes in exchange for a merciful death. This created a legal dilemma. Could a condemned man negotiate the terms of his own execution? Could he offer information about other criminals in exchange for a quick death? After 2 days of deliberation, city officials agreed. If Matthias could provide information leading to the arrest of other criminals, they would deliver the coup de grâce, the mercy blow to his head that would end his suffering. A scribe was brought to the wheel. Through an elaborate system of eye blinks, 1 blink for yes, 2 for no, Matthias began confessing to crimes he may or may not have committed. He implicated other merchants in smuggling operations. He identified officials taking bribes. He named names, provided details, all through nothing but eye movements because that was all his destroyed body could still control. The confessions took an entire day. For 8 hours, scribes recorded Matthias's accusations while he lay on the wheel, his body ravaged by infection, consumed by fever, barely clinging to consciousness. Some of the confessions were clearly false, names of people who had wronged him in business, enemies he wanted to punish even in his dying moments. Others may have been true. There was no way to verify. Finally, on the evening of his 7th day on the wheel, city officials accepted his confessions as sufficient. The executioner was summoned. Hans Schmidt approached Matthias with a heavy iron mallet, designed specifically for delivering the mercy blow. 1 strike to the temple was all it took. After 7 days of unimaginable suffering, after surviving what should have killed him within hours, after enduring exposure, infection, rats, maggots, fever, and pain beyond description, Matthias Clausen died not from his injuries, but from a deliberate blow to the head that he had purchased with false confessions and betrayals. Dr. Brandt performed an autopsy 2 hours after death. His report states that Matthias's internal organs showed signs of massive infection. His lungs were filled with fluid. His kidneys were failing. He would have died naturally within another day or 2 at most. But he couldn't wait. The suffering had become so unbearable that he was willing to condemn innocent people just to make it stop 1 day sooner. The case of Matthias Clausen became famous throughout German territories. It was cited in legal documents, discussed in medical schools, and referenced in execution manuals for the next 200 years. It proved that human beings could survive on the breaking wheel for far longer than anyone previously believed possible. And that knowledge, that understanding of just how long suffering could be prolonged, made subsequent executions even more terrible, as executioners refined their techniques to ensure victims remained conscious for days rather than hours. The breaking wheel didn't just destroy its victims, it systematically destroyed the men who operated it. Despite the financial incentives, the social privileges, and the legal protections afforded to professional executioners, the psychological toll of repeatedly shattering human bodies proved impossible to escape. Hans Schmidt, the executioner who performed Matthias Clausen's 7-day ordeal, kept a personal journal that was discovered in 1847 during renovations of his former home. The journal entries paint a devastating picture of a man slowly losing his grip on sanity. In early entries from 1610, when Schmidt was newly appointed as Heidelberg's executioner, his writing is clear and matter-of-fact. He records executions with the detachment of an accountant tallying figures. By 1618, the tone had changed completely. Schmidt wrote about nightmares where he was the one on the wheel, where his own arms were being systematically destroyed while his wife and children watched. He described waking up screaming, his hands making involuntary hammer strike motions in his sleep. His wife eventually moved to a separate bedroom because she feared him during these night terrors. The journal reveals that Schmidt began drinking heavily around 1616. He would consume nearly a liter of wine before each execution just to steady his hands. After executions, he would drink until he passed out. On days without executions, he drank to forget the ones that had already happened. By 1620, his handwriting had deteriorated into barely legible scrawls, the hand tremors he developed making it difficult to control the pen. But Schmidt was far from unique. Guild records from the German Executioners' Brotherhood show that the average career length for a breaking wheel executioner was only 12 years. Not because they retired, but because they became too psychologically damaged to continue working. Many developed what they called the executioner's shake, permanent tremors in their hands and arms that made precision work impossible. The medical condition we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder was rampant among these men, though they had no name for it at the time. They experienced flashbacks, anxiety attacks, and periods of dissociation where they would lose hours of time with no memory of what they had done. Some executioners were found wandering the streets at night, covered in blood from animals they had killed in fits of violence they couldn't remember. Friedrich Gottlieb, the executioner who broke Hans Weber in the opening of this story, ended his career in 1642 after 23 years of service. According to his physician's notes, Gottlieb had developed a condition where his hands would lock into a gripping position as if permanently holding an invisible hammer. The muscles in his forearms had become so conditioned to the repetitive motion of striking that they would contract involuntarily, causing him severe pain. He spent his final years unable to use his hands for any purpose, dependent on his family for basic care. The psychological damage often manifested in domestic violence. Court records show that executioners' families experienced abuse at rates far higher than the general population. Executioners would come home from work and brutalize their own wives and children, transferring the violence they performed publicly onto those closest to them. Some seemed unable to distinguish between their professional and personal lives, treating their families with the same cold, systematic cruelty they applied to condemned criminals. Children of executioners faced their own unique trauma. They were socially ostracized, forbidden from playing with other children, excluded from guilds and professions. Many towns had laws preventing executioners' children from becoming anything other than executioners themselves, trapping entire family lines in this cycle of violence and psychological destruction. Sons who inherited their father's position often reported feeling relief when their fathers finally died, not from grief, but from the release from an apprenticeship that had destroyed their capacity for normal human emotion. Some executioners attempted to escape their profession. A 1631 case from Munich involved an executioner named Peter Hoffmann who tried to flee his position and start a new life in a different city under a false name. He was recognized, arrested, and forcibly returned to Munich, where he was compelled by law to continue his work. The message was clear. Once you became an executioner, you belonged to that role for life. Society needed someone to operate the breaking wheel, and those who accepted the position were never allowed to leave. The most tragic cases involved executioners who developed empathy for their victims. This was considered a professional failing, a weakness that needed to be corrected. Guildmasters would punish executioners who showed mercy or hesitation by forcing them to perform additional executions without pay. Some executioners who refused to continue their work were themselves subjected to corporal punishment or imprisonment. Hans Schmidt's journal ends abruptly in 1623. The final entry, written in barely legible handwriting, reads, "I have become the thing I break. There is no difference anymore between the hammer and the bone. We are all being destroyed on the wheel, all of us. There is no escape from this circle." 3 days after writing those words, Schmidt walked into the Neckar River with his pockets filled with stones and drowned himself. He was 46 years old. His death was ruled a suicide, and like the suicide victims he had probably executed during his career, He was denied burial in consecrated ground. His body was buried in an unmarked grave outside the city walls. The city of Heidelberg appointed a new executioner within a week. The breaking wheel needed an operator, and someone had to step forward to take the position, knowing full well what it would eventually do to them. The cycle continued because society demanded it, because the law required it, because there was always someone desperate enough or damaged enough to take the job. Guild records show that by the mid-1600s, most breaking wheel executioners came from families already involved in the profession. Sons followed fathers not out of choice, but out of necessity, inheriting both the position and the psychological damage that came with it. These families became dynasties of trauma, passing down techniques for breaking human bodies alongside the mental illness those techniques inevitably produced. The executioners themselves were victims of the breaking wheel, just in a different way. They weren't tied to the wooden circle, but they were trapped within it nonetheless, condemned to repeat the same violent motions, to inflict the same suffering, to watch the same progression of human destruction until their minds fractured and their hands shook, and they could no longer tell the difference between their professional duties and their personal nightmares. In 1841, in the small Prussian town of Königsberg, the breaking wheel claimed its final official victim. His name was Johann Müller, a 47-year-old farmer convicted of murdering his neighbor during a property dispute. The execution was scheduled for August 15th, and by that point, the breaking wheel had become an anachronism, a relic of medieval brutality persisting into the industrial age. Müller was brought to the wheel at dawn, as tradition dictated. The executioner was a man named Gustav Reiner, one of the last trained practitioners of this dying art. Reiner was 53 years old and had been an executioner for 31 years. He had broken 73 men on the wheel during his career. Johann Müller would be his 74th and final victim. The execution proceeded according to the centuries-old protocol. Müller's limbs were systematically shattered, working from extremities inward. But something was different this time. The crowd that gathered wasn't the usual mix of curious townspeople and required witnesses. It included newspaper reporters, legal reformers, and medical observers who had come specifically to document what they hoped would be the last breaking wheel execution in Prussia. As Reiner worked, breaking bones with the practiced efficiency of 3 decades, photographers set up their equipment to capture the scene. This was one of the first breaking wheel executions ever photographed, though the images were later destroyed by authorities who deemed them too disturbing for public viewing. Written descriptions survive, however, and they are more than sufficient to convey the horror. Müller survived the breaking process. He remained conscious through the entire ordeal, just as the procedure intended. When Reiner finished his work and stepped back, Müller lay on the wheel, his body transformed into something that no longer resembled a functional human form. Every major bone in his limbs had been shattered. His ribcage was crushed. His collarbone jutted through his skin at an impossible angle. But his heart continued to beat. His lungs continued to draw breath. His eyes, filled with an agony beyond description, remained open and aware. Here's where the final horror of the breaking wheel revealed itself. According to Prussian law at the time, the condemned had to remain on the wheel until death occurred naturally. No mercy blow was permitted. Müller had to die from his injuries, and his body had to remain displayed on the wheel as a warning to others. The first night, Müller could still make sounds. Witnesses reported hearing low moans and wet, gurgling attempts at speech. By the second day, he had fallen silent, but medical examinations confirmed he was still alive. His heart rate was elevated. His pupils still responded to light. He was experiencing every moment of his own slow death. On the third day, something unprecedented happened. The summer heat was particularly intense that year, and Müller's body, covered in open wounds and broken skin, began to decompose while he was still alive. Flies had laid eggs in his wounds within hours of the execution. By the third day, those eggs had hatched into maggots that were consuming his flesh, while his heart still pumped blood through his veins. Dr. Heinrich Braun, one of the medical observers, documented the progression of decay. His notes describe how the maggots concentrated in Müller's deeper wounds, particularly where bones had broken through skin. The insects were literally eating him from the inside out while he remained conscious. Braun could tell Müller was still aware, because his eyes would track movement, would follow people as they walked past the wheel. On the fourth day, birds began to take interest. Ravens, crows, and magpies that normally scavenged the town's waste areas discovered this new source of food. They would land on the wheel and peck at exposed flesh, tearing away small pieces while Müller lay helpless. One particularly aggressive crow managed to reach Müller's left eye. The bird pecked at it repeatedly until the eyeball ruptured. Medical observers noted that Müller's remaining eye showed a fear response, proving he was still conscious when this happened. By the fifth day, Müller's body had entered an advanced state of decomposition. The smell was overwhelming, described by witnesses as worse than any battlefield or mass grave. Sections of his skin had turned black and begun sloughing off. The maggot infestation had spread throughout his torso, and observers could see movement beneath what remained of his skin as thousands of larvae fed on his dying but not yet dead flesh. Still, his heart beat on. Still, his chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Still, his remaining eye showed signs of consciousness and awareness. On the evening of the sixth day, Gustav Reiner, the executioner who had broken Müller's body, approached the wheel carrying his heavy iron hammer. He had not been ordered to deliver a mercy blow. He had not received permission from any authority. But Reiner had reached his breaking point. In front of dozens of witnesses, Reiner struck Müller once in the temple with his hammer. The blow was precise, professional, instantly fatal. Johann Müller died after 6 days on the breaking wheel, killed not by his injuries but by an executioner who could no longer stomach the horror he had created. Reiner was immediately arrested for exceeding his authority. He was tried, convicted of unauthorized action, and fined. But he was also quietly dismissed from his position. The authorities didn't want an executioner who showed mercy. More importantly, they didn't need one anymore. The Müller execution had been witnessed by influential legal reformers and newspaper reporters who spread the story throughout Prussia and beyond. The photographs, before their destruction, had been seen by several high-ranking officials. The medical documentation of a man decomposing while still alive proved impossible for even the most conservative judges to justify. Within 3 months, the Prussian government officially abolished the breaking wheel. Other German states followed quickly. By 1850, the device had been banned throughout most of Europe. When historians later examined Müller's body, which had been preserved for medical study, they discovered something remarkable and terrible. The autopsy showed that his heart had been damaged, but not destroyed by the breaking process. His lungs, though punctured by broken ribs, had continued functioning. His brain showed no signs of fatal trauma until the final hammer blow. Medical experts concluded that Müller could have survived on the wheel for another 3 to 5 days before his injuries would have killed him naturally. The breaking wheel had been designed to maximize suffering while preventing death. In its final application, it had succeeded perfectly. It had kept a man alive and conscious while his own body decomposed around him, while insects consumed him from within, while birds pecked out his eyes. It had functioned exactly as intended, and that perfect function is precisely what finally destroyed it. The last breaking wheel in Prussia was burned in a public ceremony in 1843. Officials made speeches about progress and civilization, but they never acknowledged the thousands of men who had been destroyed on these wheels over the centuries, the families who had been forced to watch, the executioners who had been psychologically annihilated by their work. Gustav Reiner, the executioner who had shown mercy to Johann Müller, lived another 12 years after his dismissal. He never worked again. He spent his final years in near total isolation, avoiding human contact, drinking heavily. He died in 1853 at age 65, alone in a rented room. His hands, the tools that had broken 73 men on the wheel, shook uncontrollably until the day he died. The breaking wheel was gone, but its legacy persisted. The medical knowledge gained from watching human bodies systematically destroyed. the legal precedents establishing how far state power could extend into human suffering, the psychological damage inflicted on victims, families, and executioners alike. All of this survived long after the last wheel was burned. The most horrifying revelation came decades later, when historians examining execution records discovered that many of the men broken on the wheel had been convicted of minor crimes: theft, adultery, debt evasion. Crimes that in later eras would warrant fines or brief imprisonment had once been punishable by having every bone in your body methodically shattered while doctors kept you alive and conscious as long as possible. The breaking wheel represented more than just a method of execution. It represented humanity's capacity to transform suffering into a science, to bureaucratize horror, to create systems that turned ordinary people into monsters simply by following established procedures. The executioners weren't sadists. They were professionals doing their jobs. The physicians weren't torturers. They were researchers advancing medical knowledge. The families weren't callous. They were obeying the law. And yet the result was a machine of human suffering so efficient, so terrible, that even the society that created it eventually couldn't stomach the horror of what it had made. The last turn of the breaking wheel proved what many had suspected but few dared to say, that some methods of punishment are so grotesque that they corrupt not just the punished, but everyone involved in their application. That there are forms of justice that are indistinguishable from injustice, methods of law enforcement that are themselves lawless, ways of maintaining social order that destroy the very humanity they claim to protect. Johann Müller died begging for death through eyes being eaten by crows. Gustav Reiner died with trembling hands that never stopped shaking. And the breaking wheel disappeared into history, leaving behind only the lesson that sometimes the most monstrous creations of human civilization are those that operate exactly as designed.